Hi, I'm Michael Ullman, otherwise known as the Homeless Guru. No, I'm not homeless myself, but I've worked in homeless services for over 20 years and worked in low income public housing for over 20 years too. And well, it's kind of come to this. I guess I have to use social media to get out the word. I write a lot about homelessness. I have an email and a website that has a lot of really good information you're not going to see in the local media, just because number one, they don't have the space to print anything anymore. Number two, they don't really understand the issue. Number three, the people running the system still don't really understand the issue. They always talk about affordable housing, about more people with more income, all these crazy things that kind of make sense on the surface. But I'm going to tell you three reasons why we cannot end homelessness. Whoever said we were going to end crime or end rape or end murder or end traffic tickets? I don't know why people want to actually think that they can end homelessness. And there's a couple of reasons why you can't. Number one, it is illegal to end homelessness. We have civil rights in this country. Whether you're on the left or on the right, you cannot force people off the street, every single one of them at the same time. So there's two people in history that really were able to end homelessness very effectively. Stalin and Hitler, probably a few other dictators, but their solution is to kill them, put them in camps, kill them after they've worked in camps, or just throwing them in prison and forgotten about them. That's an easy way to end homelessness. More authoritarian countries can do it. No problem. Our country, however, has civil rights. The same rights that let you have a gun, the same rights that protect you against mob rule, at least sometimes. We have civil rights, and the civil rights have actually grown a lot over the last 20 or 30 years. The idea hasn't, but the implementation through court decisions has, starting with Brown versus Board, starting with the Miranda warning that cops have to give, and a lot of other things in between. So it is illegal to end homelessness. Illegal. So can we stop using this word end? First of all, it's fantasy land. You're going to end crime. You're going to end divorce. You're going to end deadbeat dads. The list goes on. You can't end it. Number two, the second reason and the most frustrating reason for me for why you can't end homelessness is that there's an entire housing infrastructure that defines people as homeless even when they're living in it. This is something people don't know. This is part of the definition of homelessness. When people say homeless, they normally think of people living on the street, maybe living in the car, or just living in a box on the sidewalk. Well, actually, two-thirds of the people who are defined as homeless live in housing. It's what people call homeless housing, or what you know as emergency shelters and transitional housing. Well, it's kind of ironic that people who have been living in the street and are convinced to come into a shelter or to be able to get into what they call transitional housing are still defined as homeless. And the first thing they want you to do once you come into this housing is to find another place. So in the last several years, the homeless point in time count, whether it's accurate or not, which is another discussion, counted about 550 people on any one day homeless. I'm sorry, 550,000. And about 350,000 of them live in housing. About 90,000 of them live in transitional housing. Now, transitional housing is definitely not homeless. You can stay there for up to 2 years. You have a key. Nobody else can get in there. Some have kitchens. Some have common kitchens. But it's your place. The only difference between that and a public housing unit or Section 8 unit or a private market unit is, you're supposed to leave within 2 years. But 2 years is an eternity. First of all, 2 years, that's longer than a normal lease. And second of all, it's your place. You have a place to go to. When people say, do you have a place to live? People in transitional housing have a place to live. I've been and worked with many of them. Many of them are far better and provide far more amenities than somebody living in a, slumlord apartment. They're usually far cleaner too, because they get inspected a little bit more. So, we have to remember that, out of the 550,000 people every day, about 100,000 of them, and a lot of them are families with children, but some singles, especially some veterans. There's a fair amount of transitional housing for veterans. They're not really homeless. They really shouldn't be defined as homelessness. The definition came about in, 1987 when they were enacting the McKinney-Vento Homeless Act to generate funding for services. It was defined as homeless at the time because people really didn't understand homelessness. Well, they still kind of don't. And they thought these places are very, very temporary, but they're not temporary. Rental housing for a lot of low income people is never really permanent. They move a lot. A lot of people move a lot. I once moved about 8 times in 10 years, and I actually made a fair amount of money. So, transitional housing, no. Those 90,000 people, they're not homeless by any real definition. Then we have the emergency shelters. So there are about 270,000 people now living in emergency shelters. And actually, the number of beds of emergency shelter is increasing, unfortunately. And the main problem with emergency shelters is, besides the fact that most of it is crappy, and could be better easily, is it's again designed for people to just stay a few weeks, as if a few weeks is going to do the trick. A lot of people that stay in emergency shelters, a lot of which are single men in their 40s and 50s and 60s, they would stay there for a long time. It's comfortable for them. It's free. A few charge a small amount, like $100 a month after they stay. But, it is housing to define emergency shelters where you have shelter, usually free food, mail services, social workers, or at least access to some social workers. You have showers, you have laundry, you get sheets, you get blankets, you get clothing if you need. To define that as the same kind of living as somebody living in a box on the street or even living in their car, is ridiculous. You've asked somebody to come in off the streets and live in your homeless shelter. Why they are even called homeless shelters is ridiculous. They are government funded or locally funded. Actually, the federal government provides almost no funding to emergency shelters. It never really did. It only funded a little bit under the emergency shelter grants. And now it even funds very little because even the federal government, as slow as it is, realizes that emergency shelters are not the solution. I mean, what emergency shelters need to do is some of them need to fix up their place a little bit. Some of them are okay, and they just need to rename them boarding house living or hostels. They're really no different than a youth hostel or an adult hostel. Some of them need to break up their rooms, perhaps, especially with COVID fears and other fears of contagion. So 100 people don't stay in a room. They need to make a few changes. Some of them don't need to give free food out. People have access to food. That's not usually actually a big issue. And what some people don't know is at an emergency shelter, at many of them, not that many people eat there, even the people that are living there, because they still have access to some money. That's why you should charge them some money. So in the emergency shelter I worked out, about half the people every day ate there, and actually the families ate there even less, because a lot of people don't like going to the lunchroom area, and a lot of people don't really like the food. A lot of people still get food stamps, or again have some access to food, or have food in other family to bring them food. So anyway, so this is the major problem. This is actually kind of the major structural problem, is that we have people that come in from the streets who are, by any real definition, homeless. Now they're living in a house sponsored by the government, sponsored by local funds, sponsored by local taxes, and they're still called homeless. And you still want them to leave as soon as possible. Some of them don't want to leave. Why do you keep asking them to leave? Let them stay as long as they want to. So a lot of them like living in a congregate situation. It's very safe for them. So that's the biggest issue. Until you convert all of these shelters, especially the emergency shelters, into non-homeless housing, which can be done, people will still leave, giving space for other people. About half the people that come into emergency shelters don't really stay that long and move on their way. So, this is the right thing to do. How can you tell somebody to leave once they've come in from the streets? So, emergency shelters, bad. Transitional shelters, to call them homeless is ridiculous. And even HUD kind of realizes this, and that's why about 5 years ago they cut off funding for transitional housing. So that we used to have over 200,000 units of transitional housing. Now there's only about 90,000, or maybe even less, 80,000. So that's progress. A lot of them have been converted essentially into a permanent housing program. This idea of what permanent is versus what temporary is kind of ridiculous, especially for people at the lower income scales. A lot of these are kind of upper middle class values about what is proper for somebody to call it permanent housing. My wife would say permanent housing means I have my own bathroom and you can't use it. So, all right, well, let's go to the next one, the third and final, at least for now. The third factor that I want to bring up for why you can't really end homelessness is, again, another problem with the regulations regarding subsidized housing. There are over 10 million people that live in subsidized housing, and yes, for the most part, most of them, or nearly all of them, were from very low income backgrounds, very poor backgrounds, and that's why they qualified for low income housing. Now, I'm not going to get into discussion of the entire rules of subsidized housing, whether it's public housing, Section 8 housing, senior housing, and then other little less known low income tax credit housing, which is a little bit better than public housing, but again, that's another discussion. But the main problem is that although these places give families a inexpensive place to live, they, due to the regulations surrounding them, especially due to the regulation about how much income you have coming in and how that is linked towards how much rent you're going to pay, the households living there can't allow the people who might be other family members or friends to come and stay with them. And thus, this creates more homelessness. Let me explain a little more. So, most people who have a regular lease, or certainly who own their house, or have a regular apartment, outside of a few very pernicious landlords, most really don't care as long as you're paying your rent, how many people are living in your house, especially if there's family members. It's somewhat illegal almost, or it just doesn't happen if you have to let somebody else, your son, your daughter, or your daughter and a child, or even an older parent, come back and live with you. Most landlords allow people to, have more than a few people in a bedroom, or convert a bedroom, or convert the living room into a bedroom. Well, you can't do this in subsidized housing. So this prevents people who are at the low income spectrum, who are more likely to know or have in their social networks people who become homelessness. They cannot allow this house, to be used as a home. They cannot just let them come in. I've talked to many, many people, and I'm actually working on a book about this, with one of the chapters called when a house is not a home. They can't let people stay, and a lot of these people end up going to the shelter. They can't let people stay in Section 8 public housing, or they might lose their lease. They get inspected and they might lose their lease because it says that you can't let anybody else in unless you've gone through the process of putting them on the lease, but people don't want to put them on the lease because that may increase the amount of rent they have to pay, or it might be a boyfriend or even a husband or ex-husband or ex-wife who needs to stay there, and it gets way too complicated to put them on the lease, especially if they're coming and going and you're not sure how long they're going to stay. And you're not sure if they can even pay you much, or even if they say they can. A lot of women don't want to put their ex-husbands or husbands on the lease because they may or may not pay them their share of the rent. So basically, we take much of the lower end of low-income households who could be helping people who might be homeless or are homeless and let them stay. We're preventing them from helping them. So this is again another big structural reason why we cannot end homelessness, because federal housing rules, as well as some state statutes, prevent this action. In fact, specific to homeless housing, it gets even worse because they're even restricted even more. I know of more than one instance where somebody had been living on the street for 20 years, chronic alcoholic, drug addict. They housed him in one of these places, a shelter plus care, what they call it, program, where they give them an apartment and they provide supportive case management and visits at least once or twice a month. Well, hopefully, if the agency is doing their job. And I've heard more than one time that the person ends up getting kicked out because he lets a couple of his friends stay there who are also homeless. Because it's against the law to let people stay there too, because there's income issues. That's not the agreement. So he gets kicked out. So I don't know why they just don't find a place for all the people together. But this is actually a bigger issue. It kind of slides under the radar because when you ask people, it's hard to figure out because they never really know when they might need to let people stay there. In fact, in New York City, they often write about how the fact, and in other cities too, that there's many ghost tenants of public housing, people that come in after the staff or the workers leave, so they won't be seen. And it's good that they do because otherwise they probably would be living on the street or crowding the shelters more. So this is a big problem when government programs can be great, but you have to be really careful when you're putting in regulations that affect the normal way, the healthy way that families help other family members. And the prohibition of letting people come into your place is a big one. Now, obviously, you don't want 20 people in a place, but public housing actually has very few people in it. In fact, one of the problems is it has a lot of empty bedrooms. The average household size of somebody in subsidized housing, at least in public housing and Section 8 housing, is only 2.1 or 2.2 members. This is actually about a half a person less than the average household size overall. And if you think about it, if they're poor, their household size should be even greater than if they were a richer family because they do need, two or three people contributing to make the rent and to take care of things. I mean, that's what you see in a number of ethnic minorities like Filipinos and still many Asian, many Chinese and Japanese families, although not so much Japanese anymore because most of them are quite well off. Most of the Asian singles that you see in the United States are generally people that are very mentally ill, that are beyond the family's ability to really help. That's why their numbers are very, very low. You rarely see a Japanese, Chinese, Korean family with kids at a shelter, certainly not on the street. Other families are there for them. And families aren't in public housing, so they can do it and they can keep quiet. Most landlords won't even notice because they never even come to their place as long as they don't make a ruckus, and pay their rent on time. So this is a big reason. If we got rid of these regulations, there would be a lot more people that could find assistance from their natural supports. So let's go over this. You can't end homelessness. I think that should be pretty. What was I gonna say? Pretty obvious. There's no social problem that you can end. We can't end. Certainly, people like to say we can't end racism. We can't end homelessness. But again, the three reasons I talked about today are: number one, it is illegal to end homelessness. We have a Bill of Rights. We have Supreme Court decisions which, essentially say you can't just move everybody in the whole town off the street. You can actually move some people in some areas off the street, but a lot of cities and a lot of people don't really want to do that anyway. So I don't know how they somehow think that they can bring enough programs to help everybody in a way that everybody's going to accept them. And that's just not the reality, and to a large extent that's not really the problem. So number two, we have an entire industry of homeless housing. When you set forth in it, when you enter the door, when you enter your own apartment, when you enter a shared room with two or three other people, when you enter a not hostile, hostile like environment where you're sharing a large room with 20 or 40 or maybe even 100 people, you are still considered homeless. You may not consider yourself homeless. You may live there for a couple of years. I worked at a shelter where we had one guy live there for 20 years. I don't think that's temporary. So that's number two, the homeless housing industry. We need to convert that actually to permanent housing, which is relatively easy as things go. But many people are against it because it's against their values of this is not something we should call permanent, and people deserve a better place. Well, if they deserve a better place, then make your emergency shelter a little better. So, get people off of the floor, clean the place regularly. Don't offer them food. Offer a place that they can get food. Give them a kitchen. Give them some small refrigerator so they can take care of themselves. And stop telling them when they can go to the bathroom and when they can take a shower. Emergency shelters infantilize people. It's horrible. There's so many rules, and they treat them like a child, so they kind of act like a child. That's basically the way it is. And again, the third reason is we just talked about it, and it's a little bit deeper than this, but the 10 million people, or about 5 million households, living in public housing, living in subsidized housing, public housing, Section 8, senior housing, low-income tax credit housing, they are not allowed to help people who they know, their family members, their friends, by just letting them come in and stay for a while, whether it's a week, whether it's a month, whether it's a couple years. That's what people do. When your daughter and her child, break up with their family and maybe she doesn't have anywhere to go, they come back. Well, sometimes the whole family, even if they didn't break up. In other countries, that's normally what happens, is the family still lives in the family house. So, so those three reasons, forget about affordable housing right now, and we'll talk about that in the future. But these are three huge barriers. So please, I hope you like this first video. I'll try to get a little bit better. I don't really like doing videos. I'd rather be interviewed, but like I said, it's social media days, and I will never use Twitter. That I should do a separate video about, and why Twitter is a very corrosive impact on society. Outside of using it as a media release for some celebrities and events, people actually having conversations on Twitter is worse than profane language. It's basically all profane language. Okay, well, y'all leave me some comments. Tell me what you want me to discuss, any data you want me to discuss. Again, feel free to visit my website. It has a lot of good information. It has a lot of critiques. Again, I'm very liberal, but I'm just not stupid. I always say that liberals are a little bit too naive and conservatives are a little bit too mean-spirited, and that's why we can't, change some of the way we do things and, make the world a little bit better for everybody else. Okay, stay safe, y'all, and I'll talk to you soon. Homeless Guru out.